Hello. Last lecture we finished by the hormones. We have seen a brief introduction about the homeostasis and hormone regulation. Today we'll start our lecture between difference. We'll start our lecture today with the difference between two of the main definition, which is the agonist and the antagonist. So what's our agonist and antagonist? Actually, these are two important terms. Of course, it is referred to molecules that bind to the hormone binding sites of receptors. So actually, these are not hormones. They are molecules that may enhance the effect of a hormone, normal hormone, or antagonize the effect of the hormone once bound to the receptor. So agonist, actually, the definition of agonist, these are molecules that can bind to the receptor and can do all the post-receptor events and all activation in the target cell that lead to the same biological effect of a hormone. So it could be a drug. So it acts like a hormone, normal hormone, but it can either increase or make a decrease, but it acts as a hormone. Generally, we can consider natural hormone agonists, but they are natural agonists. And these, you need to know that there is a possibility that more than one hormone can bind to the same receptor. And for that given receptor, different agonists can have dramatically different potentialities or potency. While for the antagonist, these are molecules, it is the other way around, and the action is the opposite. Actually, antagonists are molecules that can bind to the receptor as well, but bind the binding of agonists. So it stops the binding either of the natural agonist or a drug. But fail, of course, once it's because it's anta, so it fails to trigger intracellular signaling events. So these kind of molecule can be used to stop the excessive biological response of a certain target cells of secreting its enzymes or its hormone due to the interaction with the receptor. So antagonists don't themselves have a useful function, but their function actually, once they bound to the receptor on the target cells, they will stop the activity of that target cells. So it can be used, this hormone antagonist, if it's antagonist to the hormone action, it can be used as drugs. So from this figure, it's a very good figure to illustrate the difference between agonist and antagonist. So keep in mind, now we are talking about agonist and antagonist as a chemical compound that bind to the receptor. Okay, it's not the natural hormones. So normally agonist, the blue circle, if it's bind to its receptor, it will induce full activation. Let's have a pointer. So once the agonist binds to the receptor, it will induce full activation. The other extreme of this action, once the antagonist binds alone, it will lead to no activation. Okay, but what if the receptor there is a competition between the agonist and antagonist, and there is a competition between them to bind to the receptor? In this case, because of the competition, because sometimes the agonist will bind, sometimes the antagonist will bind, this will lead eventually to less activation. So these are three different these are three different strategies to treat some sort of disorders that require either to increase the effect or the biological effect of a target cell, or stop the effect of biological of a target cell, or decrease the effect of a target cell. Another very good figure, it shows normally the natural, you can see here the natural ligand, which in our case here, it's the hormone. It can bind smoothly to the receptor. But if there is some malfunction in this receptor or the natural ligand, physician can use an agonist or a drug that can bind, although of course it will be to some sort, alike to the natural ligand, but it will either induce more expression of the, more induction or more activation of the biological activity of the target cells. But in other cases, antagonist is used, and you can see from the figure, the antagonist will compete with the normal ligand in order to decrease activation. So generally, the antagonist is used either to decrease the activation of the cell or even block totally the activation of the cell. Any questions? Okay. So let's talk about the regulation of hormone and how the endocrine activity is controlled. So we can summarize the function of hormones into general categories. It is important in reproduction and sexual differentiation, in development and growth, in the maintenance or homeostasis of the internal environment, and as well in the regulation of metabolism and nutrient supply. So the physiological effects of this hormone actually depend on one of very important factors, its concentration in blood and the extracellular fluid. If the concentration change, of course, the biological effect will change. So disease, actually, the hormonal disease or the endocrine disease always result when hormone concentration either are too high or too low, because it needs to be at the optimum concentration in blood and extracellular fluid. So you need to have a precise control over the circulating concentrations of hormone, and this is crucial for assuring that the optimum function of that hormone is performed. So the concentration of this normal hormone is required for most metabolic and endocrine functions. And this concentration usually, because hormones usually in our body are very potent, so normally we don't need a very large concentration or a very high concentration of that hormone. Usually are small, very small amounts, micrograms or even nanograms of concentration in the blood and the extracellular fluid. So you can see that the concentration of hormone ranges from 1 picogram to a few microgram per milliliter of blood. And as well, the rate of secretion of hormones are extremely small because you have this low concentration in the blood. So obviously the rate of secretion of this hormone will be micrograms or maximum milligram per day. The concentration of the hormone in the blood and extracellular fluid, as seen by target cells, is actually dependent on three major factors. So now we're talking how the target cell sends the optimum concentration and how the optimum concentration is achieved in the body fluid. So we have the rate of production and of course the rate of production of the hormone, and this actually is controlled and is tightly controlled by a positive and a negative feedback circuits or loops. So actually the positive feedback will enhance the secretion of more hormone in case the hormone level drops, and the negative feedback will stop or decrease the secretion of the hormone in order to keep a tight co-regulation and keep specific concentration in the blood and the extracellular fluid. The rate of delivery as well, because you may have the optimum concentration of the hormone in the blood, but the rate of delivery of that hormone to the target cell may be, for some reason, will be low, and this will lead to a decreased activity or decreased function of that hormone. So the high blood flow to the target cell may ensure, this high blood flow will ensure that the sufficient amount of hormone will reach target cells. The third factor which the target cell need to, by which the target cells can sense the concentration of hormone in the blood, is the rate of degradation and the elimination. So hormones actually, when it finishes its function, it needs to be degraded and eliminated from the circulation, because if they exist for a long time in the circulation, their effect will keep on going throughout the lifetime. So it needs to be tightly regulated through the degradation rate and the elimination rate from the blood. And they can be excreted through several routes, as we will see in the next few slides. So let's talk now about the clearance of hormone from the blood. So actually, two factors can increase or decrease the concentration of hormones of hormone in blood. You have the rate of hormone secretion into the blood from the endocrine glands, and you have the rate of removal from the blood. The rate of removal from the blood, actually, it's called metabolic clearance rate, because this hormone will be degraded and then eliminated from the blood. So any disturbance in this metabolic clearance rate will actually affect the concentration of the hormone in the blood. So to define the metabolic clearance rate, actually it is the rate of disappearance of any hormone, of a specific hormone, from the plasma concentration of the blood. So it controls the concentration of hormone in the blood. So these hormones are cleared from the plasma in several ways, including tissues can destroy metabolic destruction by tissues. The binding of the hormone from the blood to the tissue actually will decrease the concentration of that hormone from the blood. So that's a clearance as well from the blood. The excretion by the liver into bile. So now we understand that the one way of excretion of the hormones is through bile, through liver. Of course, it will remove the hormone from the blood. As well, excretion by kidney into urine. So now we have two routes for the excretion of the hormones outside our body. So we have, as we said, 4 ways to clear the hormone from the blood. Any questions? Okay. So continuing talking about the clearance of hormone from the blood. So most of the peptide hormone and the catecholamines actually are water soluble and circulate freely in the blood. And they usually, because they are peptide hormones, they usually degraded by enzymes in either blood or tissues. And they can be rapidly excreted by either kidney and liver. So they remain in the blood for a very short time because they have a very potent effect. So while there is a difference here between this kind of hormone, which is water soluble and can be degraded by the tissues or blood and excreted by kidney, and you have another type of hormone that do not circulate in the blood freely, but they need a carrier protein, which is called the plasma proteins. This carrier protein is bound to the hormone inside the blood, and it transports that hormone to the target tissue. To the target tissue. So these hormones that are bound to this plasma protein, they can be cleared at much slower rate. So that's why they can exist in the circulation for several hours or even days, take more time than the peptide hormones. So as an example, the half-life of adrenal steroid hormone in circulation range between 20 to 100 minutes. Steroid hormones, of course, like the sex hormones. Whereas the half-life time of protein like a thyroid hormone, which is the kind of protein that needs a protein carrier to transport it, it may act as long as 1 to 6 days. So you understood now the difference between these two classes of hormone and how the nature of the way they transported in the blood will affect their half-life time. So it is important now to talk about the feedback control of hormone production. And as we just said, the feedback control is very important in controlling the amount or the concentration of the hormone in the blood. And usually the negative feedback mechanism is much more preformed by the organism than the positive feedback, because it's important for the negative feedback to control the amount or the concentration of the hormone in the blood. So how this negative feedback or feedback loops is achieved, we will know in the next few slides. But first, we need to know that any disturbance in these feedback loops will lead to a clinical problem. And of course, this can be used as a diagnosis, because the significance of the amount of the hormone in the blood may lead to understanding a sort of disease. So the negative feedback loop, as we said, is much more common than the positive feedback. So what's the difference? حد عارف الفرق ما بين النيجاتيف فيدباك لوب والبوزيتيف فيدباك لوب من اللي انا قلته؟ يقدر يقول لي؟
Negative feedback تعمل inhibition of hormonal production.
والبوزيتيف فيدباك؟
It promotes hormonal production.
اوكي. طيب حد تاني يقدر يقول لي ليه النيجاتيف فيدباك ممكن تكون اهم من البوزيتيف فيدباك؟ حد تاني؟ حد تاني يقول بدل ما اسال الناس.
انه كرمال ما يصير عنا اوفر برودكشن للهرمون.
ممتاز. اوكي. So the negative feedback is seen, of course, when the output of the busway, the hormone itself, it can work against its own secretion. When the level of that hormone increases, we'll see some mechanism that this increase the amount of hormone by itself. It will control and initiate the negative feedback in order to stop its production. So that's why we say the negative feedback is seen when the output of the pathway inhibits the inputs of the pathway. So we can see here 3 levels of gland here. Starting from the hypothalamus, let's have a pointer. Starting from the hypothalamus, it secretes the first set of hormones, which is called the releasing hormone. That's why you will see later that every hormone really secreted by the hypothalamus, it needs to have in its name releasing hormone. And this will consider to be hormone 1. This hormone 1 will affect specific cells in the anterior pituitary gland to secrete the stimulating hormone, which is now it's called a second class of hormones, which is hormone 2. So any stimulating hormone, why it's stimulating? Because once it reaches the blood circulation and reaches the target gland, actually it will secrete the third class of hormones, which actually the ultimate hormone, which will induce the effect to the organism. So we have now 3 levels of secretion in order to reach to the ultimate hormone here, starting by releasing hormone, then stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, for example, and then from the target gland, you will see the target gland hormone, which is hormone 3. So what happened now if there is some increase in the production in these hormones 3? You will have that the same hormone will initiate a feedback loop, negative feedback loop, to inhibit the secretion of hormone 2. And you can see as well, if the level of hormone 3, for example, is too high, it will start to do another negative feedback loop, to stop the secretion from the higher level, which is the hypothalamus, to stop the release or down-regulate the release of hormone 1, which obviously will lead to the down-regulation of hormone 2, which lead ultimately to the down-regulation of hormone 3. So this diagram shows a simple sketch for 2 different negative feedback loops based on the target action of negative feedback loop. There is a longer feedback loop that affect the hypothalamus, and there is a shorter feedback loop that affect the anterior pituitary, for example. So actually, the decision for the hormone 3 to choose which feedback loop actually mainly will be decided by the concentration of the hormone 3 in the blood circulation. So you can see here, as an example, you have the hypothalamus. You have the hypothalamus. For example, it will secrete, for example, it will secrete the thyrotropin releasing hormone, the corticotropin releasing hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And again, you can see that every hormone that is released from the hypothalamus, it needs to have these two words, releasing hormone. And why it's called releasing hormone? Because the action of this releasing hormone on the anterior pituitary will promote the anterior pituitary to release its hormone. Now we have the tropic hormone, which is released from the anterior pituitary, and of course you need to know that thyrotropin hormone will lead to the release of the TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, while the corticotropin hormone will lead to the release of adrenocorticotropin hormone, and then the gonadotropin releasing hormone will lead to the release of the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. And this, of course, is the level of hormone 2. This will affect the target organ. And of course, you need to know that there is a different target organ for each hormone. Okay, this target organ, of course, will release either thyroid or adrenal cortex or gonads based on the type of the stimulating hormone. Now, what happens if the hormone released from these target cells, either the function is terminated for that hormone or their concentration have been increased in the blood. So you can see the negative feedback loop start by the hormones itself. A shorter negative feedback loop will affect the anterior pituitary gland, and you have a longer feedback loop will affect the hypothalamus. In both cases, this will decrease the amount of hormone 3 that's secreted from the target gland. To be more, to understand more the way the negative feedback loop works, so initially it starts with the signal that is coming from either the external environment outside the organism or the internal environment. In either cases, it will affect the So as we said, the effect or the stimulation comes from either the external environment, some necessity inside the organism to secrete a specific type of hormone, and the other factor can be affected by the the external, either internal or external. So this generally will lead to the stimulation of the central nervous system, which will convey an electrical or chemical transmission to be conveyed to the hypothalamus, one of the master, as we said before, one of the master glands that exists in the brain. This hypothalamus will affect the anterior pituitary, will affect directly one of the major glands as well in the brain, which is called the pituitary gland. And we'll deal in details with the pituitary gland. So you need to understand first, the pituitary gland consists of two parts: anterior pituitary gland and posterior pituitary gland. In one axis of the hypothalamus, it will affect the posterior pituitary gland through axonal transport, because every neuron have an axon. So the hypothalamus sends its signal through the axon, so that's why it's called axonal transport, and will affect the posterior pituitary gland. It will affect the posterior pituitary gland to release two hormones, and the only hormones is the oxytocin and vasopressin. These two hormones, as we said, it will secrete, although they are forming in the hypothalamus, as we will know later, but they are secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, which have another name, which is called neurohypophysis. It's called neurohypophysis. So neurohypophysis, actually, it is the posterior pituitary gland. The release of these two hormones, the oxytocin and vasopressin, from the posterior pituitary gland, it will affect, the oxytocin will affect the uterine contraction, and the lactation. And of course, it has a major effect in the process of delivery of the babies, and as well the lactation of the baby after delivery. While the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ADH, or vasopressin, so vasopressin has another name called ADH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, antidiuretic hormone. So this antidiuretic hormone or the vasopressin, it will control the water balance inside our body. So actually it is critical in the function of the kidney, as we will see later. So this is one of the axes of the hypothalamus that lead to the release of two hormones. The second axis, it will affect the adeno hypothesis. And the adeno hypothesis is the second name for the anterior pituitary gland. So through the process, as we said in the last few slides, through the secretion of nanograms of releasing hormones. Once the adeno hypothesis or the anterior pituitary gland sends these releasing hormone, it will start to secrete in micrograms the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland that will affect the target glands that will release its ultimate hormone either in micrograms or milligrams. Now, once the hormone is in the circulation, it will, of course, it will provoke the function of that hormone. If it's insulin, for example, of course, the insulin is not secreted from the pituitary gland. And if it's a steroid hormone, it will affect the function of the gonads. So now we have hormones either came from the anterior pituitary gland, the adeno hypophysis, or came from the posterior pituitary gland, the neurohypophysis. These hormones now in the circulation, so it needs to be tightly controlled. So here comes the negative feedback loops. So you'll see here, there is a very short negative feedback loop that starts from the anterior pituitary and try to shut down the effect of the hypothalamus or the secretion of the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And you have another long feedback loop that can affect the three levels through the adeno blocks the secretion of the adeno hypophysis, or even blocks the hypothalamus, or even stops the signals coming from the central nervous system. And as you said, the decision of the long feedback loop or the short feedback loop will depend on the amount of the or the concentration of the ultimate hormone in the blood. What is interesting that there is another feedback loop, which is a very fast feedback loop, and it only affected the adeno hypophysis and the hypothalamus. Okay, so this figure shows that you have different level of a negative feedback loop, and of course, as we said, depend on the amount or the concentration of the hormone in the blood. Any question, Shabab? Okay. So another diagram to illustrate the three layers or three tiers in which the successive information are conveyed from tier 1, which is the hypothalamus, to tier 2, which is the pituitary gland, to tier 3, to the target organ. So you have the hypothalamus, it will secrete the hypothalamic hormones, and then you have tier 2, which is the pituitary, it secretes paracrine cytokines and growth hormones and growth factors. And you have the target gland, which will action and which will start its secretion of the peripheral hormone, which are the ultimate hormones based on the effect of the pituitary trophic hormones secreted from the pituitary gland. And of course, all of these tiers start with the central nervous system inputs. So what happens now if there is something wrong with the regulation of the endocrine glands or of the regulation of the hormone concentration in the blood? So generally, there are a lot of endocrine disease, and scientists have divided or classified or categorized these endocrine disease into 5 broad categories. Either there are hormone, of course, we are talking about the ultimate hormone or the peripheral hormone. If there is a hormone overproduction, and that comes from the hyperfunction of a target gland, this will lead to endocrine disease. As well, if there is a hormone underproduction, that means there is a hypofunction or decrease in the function of that gland. As well, if already the hormone is normal concentration range of concentration inside the blood, but the problem here comes from the tissue. The tissue either have the tissue may have low number of receptors that is needed to interact with the circulating hormone. And now the disease, and this type of endocrine disease will arise from the altered tissue response, because it's not having this tissue or this target gland is not having the optimum amount or the optimum number of receptor expressed inside this target cell, and this will lead to decreased function of the hormone. Maybe you have it, in some cases, you have tumors of endocrine glands. And these endocrine, if there is a tumor in endocrine gland, you obviously, it will have a lot of cells. And a lot of cells mean, if this is endocrine gland, so a lot of cells will secrete a lot of hormones. And it will have a major function in the control of this concentration of that hormone in the blood. The fifth category, if there is the cases where there is hormone deficiency, so the hormone is totally absent, this of course will lead to endocrine disease. The sixth category, if you have an defect in the second messenger, and if you remember from last lecture, second messenger, it is something concerned. So actually, these are 6 categories, not 5 categories. So second messenger, if you remember, حد فاكر السكند messenger هي ايه يا شباب؟ عشان اقول لكم. شباب حد فاكر السكند messenger؟
Yes, مرقت معنا بالتابي protein pathway.
اكيد مرقت معنا، عشان كده انا بسأل يا دلال. حد يقدر يقول لي ايه هي السكند messenger؟
كان PIP2 بالتابي protein pathway.
اوكي، حد تاني يقول لي مثل تاني؟ سارة سياس. سارة شكلها مش معانا. مايا الرفاعي. طب طب لحظة، هاخد كده بسرعة كده الاتندنس. عبد الشهاب بسرعة.
هون دكتور.
عبد الرحمن.
هون دكتور. نعم.
دلال القيسي.
Yes, هون دكتور.
دلال الجمعة.
Yes, doctor.
دينا مكاتي.
Yes, doctor.
اوكي، حليمة. كارين.
أنا هون دكتور.
ملكة تاني.
Yes, doctor.
مين حجار.
Yes, doctor.
رزان.
Yes, doctor.
ساينة. نظمية.
Yes, doctor.
شيرين الإمام. حليمة.
دكتور حليمة بالparticipants بس usually ما بتقدر تحكي، هي تفتح المايك.
ليه المايك بتاعها موجود؟ So now we have seen the 6 categories that may lead to an endocrine disease. Now we talk more in details to see the crosstalk and the importance of 2 of the major glands that control a lot of hormone in our body, which is the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So to understand, both glands exist in the brain. So starting, this region is called thalamus, and you have the hypothalamus just below the thalamus. And then you have the pituitary gland. As you can see, this pituitary gland is just below and in connection with the hypothalamus. So these are the location of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So again, so the hypothalamus, actually, you can see from the figure here, the region that is amplified below here. And you can see that the hypothalamus is located in the middle base of the brain. And it is encapsulated in ventral position in a region in the brain which is called third ventricle. So actually it is encapsulated ventrally to the third ventricle. While the pituitary gland, which is called the hypophysis, this pituitary gland lies, as you can see from the figure, lies just below the hypothalamus and is connected by a structure which is called the infundibulum. And actually, this pituitary gland is resting on a region of a bone, this bone structure of the skull, which is called sella torica, at the base of the brain. Okay, so normally the normal size of this pituitary gland is 1 centimeter in diameter, and the weight is almost 1 gram. So we'll see later in the coming few slides how this very small sized gland, which is a pituitary gland, is very crucial in a lot of hormones that control a lot of function in our body. So the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus can integrate a lot of function that needed to maintain the homeostasis, either chemically or the temperature homeostasis. So it controls the release of hormone from the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, because it sends order for these 2 regions to secrete its own hormones. So as we said before, it synthesizes the releasing hormone. Because majorly the hypothalamus, actually, it's not a true gland, but it consists of cell bodies of the neuron. If you remember, the neuron consists of a cell body and axon. So majorly the hypothalamus consists of cell bodies of that neuron. And this, the hormone is transported down the axon of this neuron and stored in the nerve endings. And then the hormones will be released in pulses toward its destination, either the anterior pituitary or the posterior pituitary. So as we said, generally the hypothalamus secretes the hypothalamic releasing hormone. There are 7 releasing hormones are made in the hypothalamus. The TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, the corticotropin releasing hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the growth hormone releasing hormone, and the growth hormone releasing inhibiting hormone. So actually, this is the antagonist for the growth hormone releasing hormone. And then we have the prolactin releasing hormone or factor, and then we have the prolactin inhibiting hormone. And of course, both of them are needed for the regulation of the amount of prolactin the concentration of the prolactin in the blood later. So we have 7 hormones, 7 releasing hormones are secreted from the hypothalamus. This actually, most of the secretions from the hypothalamus actually is controlled and influenced by emotions, and can be influenced as well by the metabolic state of the individual. So these hormones are delivered to the anterior pituitary gland, and now why we said only the anterior pituitary gland? Because the way of delivering of this releasing hormone or the other set of hormones to the posterior pituitary gland is different, as we'll see in the later few slides. So the releasing hormone, these 7 releasing hormone, is delivered to the anterior pituitary gland via a structure. It's called hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So actually it's a system of blood capillaries, okay, that are needed to convey the hormones, this releasing hormone from the hypothalamus to the endocrine, to the anterior pituitary gland. So in the connection between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, you have the thalamus, which receives the sensory information. When the central nervous system senses the changes in the internal or external environment and gives signals to, this will convey to the thalamus, receives the sensory information. And this thalamus will convey or relays the information to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus actually monitors the body for a lot of factors, including the temperature, pH, and other conditions. So the hypothalamus now will signal the pituitary if conditions need to be corrected. It will signal the pituitary to release the hormone that is needed at a certain point. So the pituitary is the master gland in our body and signals a lot of other glands to produce their hormones when needed. As we said, the anterior part of the pituitary gland, which is called also adenohypophysis, receives signal from the hypothalamus and respond by sending out the appropriate hormone to other endocrine gland or the target glands. While the posterior pituitary gland is totally different mechanism between the signaling between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. It receives only 2 hormones, which is oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, or vasopressin as well. They receive it from the hypothalamus gland as well as necessary. So you can see here the difference. So you have the hypothalamus. So you have the hypothalamus. Again, sorry. You have the hypothalamus just on top of the anterior pituitary gland. And for the anterior pituitary gland, you have the anterior part and you have the posterior part. This is like a diagram from the outside or even a section. But here you can see there is a major difference in the distribution of the neurons. For the neurons, which is concerned with the anterior pituitary, the terminal ends of the neuron terminate before the anterior pituitary. While for the neurons that produce the oxytocin and vasopressin, you can see that the axon extends until reaching the posterior pituitary. And this shows the difference in relaying the signal from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland is totally different between the relaying is totally different between the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Again, another figure. So you can see here again more illustrative figure. You can see here that here is the hypothalamus, and of course these neurons, cell body, and these are the axons. You can see it terminates here because it terminates in the blood, and this blood will relay or carry the signal coming from the hypothalamus until reaching to the anterior pituitary gland, which will induce to secrete its own hormone that is secreted to the blood. And this what we called, and this structure, what we called hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. While you can see here in the posterior pituitary gland, in the posterior pituitary part of the gland, you can see that their neurons have the axon extend all the way until reaching the posterior pituitary gland, and they secrete its secretion directly in the blood, and then conveyed outside the posterior pituitary gland. So it's important to understand that hormones secreted from the posterior pituitary gland, which are the oxytocin and the ADH or vasopressin, actually they are centralized in the hypothalamus, and they are only conveyed through the axon until reaching the blood system or the blood capillaries in the posterior pituitary gland, and they are transported outside the pituitary to posterior pituitary gland. So actually, you need to understand, up till now, we can say that the posterior pituitary part of the gland have no major effect on the hormone that comes from the hypothalamus, because they are secreted as it is. While this scenario is different for the anterior pituitary gland, because the releasing hormone starts from the hypothalamus, will be secreted in the blood, and once it comes to the anterior pituitary gland, it will stimulate specific cells in the anterior pituitary gland to start to secrete their own hormones. So actually, the hormones secreted from the anterior pituitary gland is totally different from the hormones secreted from the hypothalamus. Any question يا شباب؟ في حد فاهم بس الفرق، او حد يقدر يشرح لي الفرق ما بين الهرمونز اللي بتطلع من الانتيريور بيتيوتري والهرمونز اللي بتطلع من البوستيريور بيتيوتري؟ حد يقدر يقول لي؟ ناخد كده عبد الرحمن.
نعم دكتور.
قول لي الفرق يعني، قول لي السؤال. سمعت السؤال؟
سمعته.
يلا كده.
البوستيريور هو ما عنده افك على الهرمون اللي بيجوا من الهايبوثالامس بالاحرى. اما الانتيريور لا عنده افكت عليهم، لانه الهايبوثالامس يعمل ريليز للبلاد وبعدين بيروح على الانتيريور.
ممتاز. طيب ناخد كده ملك تاني تقول لي ايه الفرق ما بين النيورونز اللي طالعه من الهايبوثالامس وراح على الانتيريور بيتيوتري والنيورونز اللي طالعه من الهايبوثالامس وراح على البوستيريور بيتيوتري. ملك تاني.
Yes, doctor.
يلا جو اهيد. جو اهيد يا ملك.
يا دكتور معك أنا بحتاج.
نعم.
هلا البوستيريور بيطلعوا بس تو هرمونز اللي هن
انا ما بقولش الهرمونز اللي بتطلع، انا بقول لك الفرق ما بين النيورونز في الاثنين. ايه الفرق؟ ملك؟
يا دكتور أنا هون.
ايه الفرق؟ ما تردي. مش عارفه اقولي باس وخلاص.
أوكي باس.
اوكي حليمه؟ حليمه؟ حليمه سامعاني؟ كريم؟
Yes doctor.
اتفضلي يا كريم، ايه الفرق؟
nerves extending على posterior pituitary هن longer، فهون بيصير في release للهرمونز directly into the blood.
ممتاز.
بينما nerves extending to the anterior pituitary هن shorter، فحيصير النتورك أطول إنه كرمال يصير في ريليز من ال anterior pituitary gland through the capillaries.
ممتاز. شكرا يا كريم. Okay, so we'll continue. So again here we will see that to summarize the effect of hypothalamus on the pituitary gland from a very good figure. So as we said, we have two types of neurons, the green neurons and the orange neuron. And as you can see, the green neurons is much shorter than the orange neuron, because the orange neurons come from the hypothalamus, it extends all the way down until reaching the posterior pituitary gland. while the green neurons, which will affect the anterior pituitary gland, it only stops before entering the anterior pituitary gland. So let's talk first about the green neurons. So we have these neurosecretory cells, because they secrete the releasing hormone, produce, of course, the releasing hormone. And this releasing hormone will move through the axon. You can see these are the green circles. So these green circles will move through the axon until reaching the terminal of the axon. Once in the terminal of the axon, these green circles are secreted in the capillaries of the hypophyseal portal system, and these blood capillaries will convey through the blood flow will convey these green signals into the endospecific endocrine glands in the anterior pituitary gland to start secrete, and they order these specific endocrine gland to start secrete their specific hormones, which is represented here by the red squares. So now we have red squares that is released under the effect of green circles. So red squares, actually, it is hormones which is secreted from specific cells in the anterior pituitary gland, released under the effect of the green circles, which is a releasing hormone, which is secreted from the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. And this is the story of the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So for this story of the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland, you can see that the neurosecretory cells will start secreting oxytocin and ADH, represented here by blue triangle. And this blue triangle will straight away go into the blood capillaries and release outside of the posterior pituitary gland. So you can see here that the posterior pituitary gland have no major effect on the structure of the hormone released, because it originally comes from the hypothalamus. فاهمين يا جماعة الجزء ده كويس؟
Yes, doctor.
Okay. So let's here summarize the different effect between the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. To summarize the types of enzymes, the types of hormones secreted. So you have as well the hypothalamus on the top, and then you have the anterior pituitary adenohypophysis, and you have the posterior pituitary neurohypophysis. Of course, the types of hormones secreted from these anterior pituitary, including TSH, will affect the thyroid gland. The ACTH will affect the adrenal cortex. The GH, growth hormone, will affect the bone and muscles. The gonadotropin hormones will affect the gonads. The prolactin will affect the mammary gland in mammals, while the melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, will affect the melanocytes in amphibia, for example. And of course, melanocytes, that's mean coloration of the skin. While the posterior pituitary gland, you have only two major hormones, the ADH and oxytocin. And oxytocin, of course, is important during pregnancy. It will affect the uterine muscle, and as well, it will affect the lactation. While the ADH, one of the very important hormone, it will controls the rate of clearance of water from the kidney. So both hormone actually is very important hormones. So this figure is a very good figure. It shows the hormones which is released from the pituitary gland and their target organs. So here, let's have another sketch to summarize the difference. So we have anterior pituitary gland release thyrotropin affect thyroid gland. You have growth hormone. Basically, it will have a lot of effect. So it may lead to increase in the blood sugar. It will affect the growth of the individual. You have the corticotropin affect the adrenal cortex, which will secrete ACH as well, input into the increasing blood glucose level. You have the FS, follicle stimulating hormone. It will affect the ovary as well. The luteinizing hormone, LH will affect the ovary as well. You have the prolactin, and as I said, the prolactin will affect the mammary gland. And of course, the increased blood level, blood glucose level, it will affect the secretion of another hormone, which is insulin, which actually comes, as you all know, from the pancreas. In that slide, you can see that we'll talk in details after that, for each hormone, about these different cell types. So this actually a diagrammatic sketch of the different cells inside the anterior pituitary gland. So you can see there is an alpha cell, and you can see there is a beta cell, and you can see there is a gamma cell, and you can see there is a delta cell, basophil cell, and you can see there is an epsilon acidophil cell. So obviously, anterior pituitary gland must have different types of cells, different types of endocrine cells, because each type of these cells will be responsible to secrete a different stimulating hormone. So you can see now you have somatotropins, which are responsible for the human growth hormone. You have corticotropes, and these actually the name of these specific cells in the anterior pituitary gland. These corticotropes, it will release the adrenocorticotropin hormone. You have the thyrotropes, it will release the TSH. You have the gonadotropes, it releases the LH and FSH. And you have as well the lactotropes, it will release the prolactin hormone. So it's not kind of like the anterior pituitary gland have one type of cell and secrete all these hormones. No, for each of the hormones secreted from the anterior pituitary gland, you have a specific cell type responsible for that. في حد عنده أسئلة يا جماعة الجزء اللي فات؟
بس دكتور عفوا،
اتفضل.
في سيل بتعمل برودكشن لكذا هرمون اللي هن من هيدول؟
في عندك أبسط مثال الجوناتوتروبس.
ايه صح
بتطلع LH و FSH.
اوكي ثانك يو.
طيب نسأل كده ملك تاني.
Yes, doctor.
في عندي كم type of cells في الفيجر دوت؟
5.
4.
4. sorry.
4 صح؟
صح.
طب نسأل كده رزان، 4 صح ولا غلط؟
5
يعني 4 صح ولا غلط؟
غلط.
طب كام سيل تايب عندي انا قلته؟
عندنا 5.
5. طب ال5 دول بيعملوا سكريشن لكام هرمون؟
ل 6.
لا 6. طب نسأل حد تاني. سارة. 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 سارة شكلها مش معانا. دلال جمعة.
Yes, doctor.
طيب زميلتنا هنا قالت عندنا 5 cells secrete 6 enzymes 6 hormones. كلامها صح ولا غلط؟
Yes.
طب ليه 6 المفروض 5؟
لأنه عنا نحن الجونادوتروبس اللي هن ال LH وال FSH are secreted by the same cell type.
ممتاز، شكرا. Okay. طيب we'll continue. So from this up till now, from this slide, we need to understand that every type of hormone is secreted by a specific cell type in the anterior pituitary gland. Here in the last slide today, we'll see a summary of these type of hormones, of the types of the releasing hormones secreted from the hypothalamus. So I have the TRH, which is actually very small hormone, peptide of only 3 amino acids. And of course, it will stimulate the secretion of TSH by thyrotropes. And you have the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It is a 10 amino acid peptide. And of course, it will stimulate, this one is coming from the hypothalamus. It will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH by gonadotropes. And then you have the corticotropin hormone, and it is a single chain of 41 amino acids. And of course, it will promote the secretion by ACTH from the corticotropes. And then you have the growth hormone releasing hormone, 44 amino acids, and of course it promotes the secretion of growth hormone from somatotrophs. And then you have the counter hormone, which is the somatostatin, or for the growth hormone, which is called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. It's only 14 amino acid single chain peptide, and of course its main function is to inhibit the secretion of growth hormone by somatotrophs. And then you have the prolactin inhibiting hormone, and actually its structure, it's the dopamine, a type of a catecholamine, and it's of course from its name it inhibits the synthesis and secretion of the prolactin by lactotrophs. So actually this slide summarized the types of releasing hormones and their structure and their effect on or action on the anti-pituitary gland. And by this slide, it concludes our lecture for today, and I'm waiting for any question. في حد عنده أي سؤال يا شباب؟
Yes, doctor. كأنه مكتوب هون exam 1, so لحديد this lecture حيكونوا
ممتاز.
included.
الميد تيرم هيبقى لغاية السلايد ديت. اوكي؟
هو week 7, right?
week 7 إن شاء الله.
So after 3 weeks?
أيوه. في حد عنده مشكلة؟
No.
اوكي. ممكن في حد عنده اي سؤال؟ يبقى كده احنا عرفنا مبدئيا الميد تيرم هيبقى لغايه سلايد رقم 16. اتفقنا يا شباب؟
يس ان شاء الله.
وتاني معلومه مهمه لازم تعرفوها، حاجتين، ان الميد تيرم هيبقى ويك 7 وطبعا اكيد اون كامبس. اوكي يا شباب؟
الاكزام هيكون true and false او MCQ او كيف؟ في كتابه؟
الاكزام في ناس جربتني قبل كده في الامتحانات ولا مفيش؟
لا, I don't think so, not yet. This is the first course
لا
we're taking with you.
لا في ناس جربتني اكيد، يعني انا درست بعضكم.
في جامعه البيولوجي.
في ايه؟
في جامعه البيولوجي.
اكيد. anyway الاكزامز بتاعتي بتبقى combination ما بين 4 or 5 types of max، يعني 4 or 5 types of questions. والكلام ده انا بقوله برضو قبل الامتحان. MCQ, complete, true and false and correct the false, labeled drawing، يعني بجيب لك diagram واقول لك حط الليبلز عليها، comparison, give the scientific expression، okay، وshort essay or define، يعني ممكن اجيب لك expression واقول لك يا اما define يا اما اسالك سؤال الاجابه بتاعته لا تتعدى سطرين او 3. فهمتوا انواع الاسئله؟
Yes, doctor.
اوكي. anyway انا بقول لك الكلام ده قبل الامتحان كمان. في حد عنده اي سؤال تاني يا شباب؟
No, doctor.
اوكي. شكرا جزيلا and see you next week. Okay.
اوكي دكتور.
Bye bye.